The ocean is on fire. Not waves in a fire. Orange and black rolling and alive, feeding on steel. The USS Franklin, Big Ben, burns in the heart of the Pacific, March 19, 1945. Her flight deck glows red like a forge, bombs cooking off in chain reactions that tear open the sky. Sailors run as shadows swallowed by smoke, uniforms aflame, their screams drowned by the thunder of detonations that make the sea itself tremble. The carrier lists 23 degrees to port, its bow dipped toward death, its island tower shredded. From 5 miles away, men aboard other ships whisper that she's finished. No ship could live through that. But in the black haze above the inferno, a single figure moves, Commander Joe Taylor, crawling across the molten deck to the forward bomb elevator, dragging a hose that hisses like a serpent. Behind him, Father Joseph O'Callahan, the ship's chaplain, walks upright through the fire, his cassock charred, giving last rites to boys who have no faces left to save. The deck heaves, the horizon tilts, the air turns to ash, and still, the Franklin does not die. Because inside her steel heart, something impossible is happening. Men are refusing to let go. The morning began with a false calm. The USS Franklin steamed 60 miles off the coast of Japan, cutting through a glass-still sea under a washed-out sun. Her decks were alive with the rhythm of routine. Armorers loading 500-pounders onto Avengers, mechanics wiping oil from Corsair wings, ordnance crews stacking rockets under the island's shadow. Music drifted from the loudspeakers, a swing tune crackling through static, and for a brief hour it felt like just another sortie day. Captain Leslie Garris stood on the bridge, his cap immaculate, watching the sea with the practiced detachment of a man who'd stared at too many horizons. At 0700 the order came. Launch strike on Honshu industrial targets. The ship turned into the wind, engines humming through the deck plates. Below, the air smelled of gasoline, cordite, and coffee. Men joked, smoked, cursed, sweated, a city afloat. The Franklin was a behemoth of 27,000 tons and 3,400 souls. Her hangar packed wall-to-wall with armed planes. Her magazines stacked deep with ordnance for the raids that would soften Japan before invasion. No one noticed the small speck on the radar, a single blip fading in and out, a Yokosuka D4Y Judy, flying low through the morning haze. At 0707, the lookouts saw it. Too late. The Judy came out of the clouds, sunlight flashing off its wings, diving from astern at almost vertical angle. The first bomb struck the flight deck near the island, punching through to the hangar before detonating. The second hit seconds later, slicing through the deck elevator shaft, bursting in the bowels of the ship where hundreds of men were arming planes. The world turned white. A pressure wave tore through compartments, flinging bodies like leaves. The hangar erupted, gasoline ignited, bombs cooked off, ammunition lockers burst open. Fireballs rolled the length of the ship. Men screamed, disappeared, reappeared running, burning, trying to reach ladders that no longer existed. Above, the flight deck buckled. Planes exploded one after another. Avengers, Corsairs, Hellcats, their wings cartwheeling into the sea. The sound was apocalyptic, the ship's metal bones shrieking, bulkheads twisting. Secondary detonations booming from deep within. Commander Joe Taylor, damage control officer, was thrown across the deck, but somehow stayed conscious. He grabbed a fire hose, found that the water lines were dead, pumps shattered. "Portable extinguishers!" he shouted, voice raw. His men obeyed blindly, rolling foam canisters through pools of burning fuel. Inside the island, Captain Garris barked into the intercom, demanding reports. None came, the radio room was gone, vaporized. Smoke poured through the bridge windows, filling every lung. Still, Garris refused to abandon ship.
"We'll not lose her!"
he yelled. "We'll not!" Below decks, the forward hangar was hell incarnate. Survivors described it later as walking through the core of the sun. Every plane was a bomb, every man a matchstick. Ammunition cooked off in steady rhythm, a staccato heartbeat of destruction. In the midst of it, Father Joseph O'Callahan appeared. No helmet, no gas mask, his glasses cracked. He moved calmly through the inferno, dragging wounded men toward the light, blessing those he couldn't save. One sailor remembered seeing him lift a live bomb with his bare hands, rolling it clear of the fire before collapsing from smoke. When they tried to stop him, he only said, "If you run, someone else dies." By 0730, the Franklin was a floating volcano. The flight deck was a single sheet of fire, the hangar an open wound. From nearby ships, crews watched in disbelief. The cruiser Santa Fe maneuvered dangerously close, ignoring the risk of sympathetic explosion, to throw hoses and rescue lines. Men jumped from the Franklin's sides, hitting the water still burning, their oil-soaked uniforms igniting again as they surfaced. Lieutenant Commander Lipscomb, in charge of engineering, stayed below to keep power to the pumps. He and his team were last seen waist-deep in smoke, manually venting steam to prevent the boilers from exploding. None of them made it out. By 0800, 2/3 of the crew were dead or missing. The carrier listed badly. Water flooded through ruptured fire mains. Still the flag flew. O'Callaghan reached the bridge, soot-covered, coughing blood. "Captain," he rasped, "we need to jettison the bombs before the next chain goes." Garrus looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "You'll never make it down there." "Then I'll die where I'm supposed to," the priest replied, and disappeared again into the smoke. Those who survived said that was the moment the Franklin stopped being a ship and became a legend. A thing held together not by steel, but by faith and stubborn will. At Arrow 8:30, explosions flung the remaining planes overboard. The deck was cratered, twisted, still burning, but the fires were finally dying down. The sea was littered with bodies and wreckage. The Santa Fe drew closer still, her crew hauling survivors aboard with ropes, hands raw and bleeding. When the smoke finally cleared, the Franklin was a ghost, her flight deck melted, her superstructure mangled, every surface black. And yet, she still floated. Engines dead, radios gone, steering jammed, but afloat. Against every law of physics, she refused to sink. The destroyers circling her signaled the incredulous question, "Do you require assistance abandoning ship?" The reply blinked back in Morse from her battered bridge. "Still fighting fires." And they were. The sound never stopped. It wasn't just the roar of flames or the thunder of explosions. It was the ship itself, alive, screaming through every bulkhead and girder, its metal skin expanding and tearing as the fire inside her lungs tried to escape. Every few seconds came another concussion, a hollow boom from deep within the Franklin's belly where fuel tanks ruptured and bombs cooked off. Men described it later as standing inside a volcano that refused to die. Below the main deck, corridors had become chimneys. Smoke poured through ventilation shafts thick as tar. The heat bent steel door frames, melted light fixtures, and stripped paint from the walls in long, dripping rivulets. The temperature in some compartments exceeded 600 degrees. The men who hadn't been burned alive were suffocating in the dark. The fire was no longer an enemy to fight. It was everywhere, inside the walls, inside their lungs, inside their thoughts. Chief Petty Officer Harold Bingham led a damage control team down toward the hangar, his men crawling low under the smoke. Gas masks half melted, boots sinking into a river of oil. The deck beneath them hissed, hot enough to blister through the soles. They moved past bodies curled in impossible shapes, burned beyond recognition, their dog tags fused to their chests. One man, still alive, clutched at Bingham's ankle as they passed. His lips were gone, but his eyes begged the same word over and over, air. "Hang on, sailor," Bingham shouted, dragging him toward the ladder well. But the man was already gone. Above them, a new explosion rocked the ship. One of the 1,000-pound bombs in the hangar, touched off by the rising heat. The blast blew open the bulkhead ahead, filling the passage with light so bright it erased everything. When Bingham woke again, he was alone. His eardrums had burst. All he could hear was the ringing silence of death. He staggered forward through a world of smoke and fire, feeling his way along the wall until his hands found the edge of the hangar deck. What he saw was beyond comprehension. The space that had once held the Franklin's proud air group was now a cathedral of flame, a cavern of twisted girders and molten metal. Bomb racks burned like candles. Avenger torpedo bombers hung upside down from their own chains, their wings shredded, their torpedoes glowing cherry red. Every few seconds, another one detonated, sending shock waves through the hull. Men were still down there, dozens of them, trapped beneath debris, calling for help. Some crawled through the wreckage, their uniforms aflame, heading for the open elevator shaft that now gaped straight up to the sky. And then he saw him again, Father O'Callaghan. The chaplain was standing in the middle of the inferno, a silhouette against pure light, one arm raised as if holding back the fire itself. Around him, surviving sailors were forming a human chain, passing bombs hand to hand, unexploded ordnance still hot from the blast, rolling them over the side through the elevator hatch to keep them from igniting. Each one could have ended them all. They didn't stop. "Keep it moving, boys," the priest shouted, voice raw but steady. "God's work is yours to finish." The men cheered through the smoke, half delirious, and obeyed. It wasn't heroism. It was instinct, the refusal to die when death had already claimed you. Bingham joined the chain, grabbing a bomb casing that burned his gloves through. He passed it along, felt his knees give way, crawled forward, and somehow kept going. In the compartments below, Chief Engineer Frank Kitchen and his machinists fought a battle of their own. The fire was creeping toward the magazines, hundreds of tons of high explosives stored in the lower decks. If the flames reached them, the Franklin would vanish in a single flash. Kitchen ordered seawater flooding into the lower holds, but the pumps were gone. So they opened the valves by hand, wrenching them against the heat until the pipes burst steam and boiling water. One man's hands fused to the valve wheel. He screamed once, then kept turning until it closed. By 0900, the ship was still burning stem to stern. The flight deck sagged in the middle like the spine of a broken beast. Men crawled through it as through a dream, smoke stung, eyes blistered, finding others by touch alone. Some carried hoses that hissed uselessly. The lines had no pressure. Others used fire blankets, their own shirts, anything that could smother flame. Lieutenant Commander Taylor, skin blackened from smoke, led the forward repair parties in silence. He no longer gave orders. There was nothing left to command. When the next explosion tore through the ready room, he simply covered his head and waited for it to end. Then he stood, walked out into the blinding heat, and kept working. The Franklin was no longer fighting to win, only to endure. At 0930, the cruiser Santa Fe made her move. Against orders, Captain Harold Fitz of the Santa Fe brought his ship alongside the Franklin, closing to within 100 feet, so close the two hulls scraped together. Through the smoke, his men threw lines, stretched gangways, shouted themselves hoarse over the roar of the sea. The first wave of survivors stumbled across, burned, blind, some carrying others on their backs. The Santa Fe's deck crews caught them, dragged them clear, doused them with seawater. Some dropped dead the moment their boots hit steel. From the Franklin's shattered bridge, Captain Garris watched. The decision to abandon ship hung in the air like a sin. He couldn't do it. The carrier still floated. Somewhere beneath his feet, men were still alive. He clenched his fists. "We hold," he whispered. "By God, we hold." Down on the hangar deck, O'Callaghan collapsed against a bulkhead. The firelight flickered across his face. Around him, sailors knelt, not to pray but to rest their bodies against the cool steel that wasn't burning yet. The priest looked up at the torn ceiling, where sunlight pierced through the smoke in narrow golden shafts. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not today." By noon, the worst of the inferno had finally begun to subside. The fire still burned deep inside the ship, but the upper decks were cooling. Steam drifted from ruptured pipes. The Franklin was scarred beyond recognition, her island tower a skeleton, her decks warped and cratered, but she still floated, listing heavily to port, defying the Pacific itself. The surviving crew gathered wherever they could stand. Some wept. Some stared blankly at nothing. Every face was gray with ash, every uniform black. They had fought a battle no one was supposed to survive, and somehow they still breathed. From the Santa Fe's bridge, Captain Fitz looked back one last time before ordering his ship to pull away. "God help them," he said softly. On the Franklin, the American flag still flew from the mast, shredded, blackened, but standing. The wind off the sea tugged at its edges, and it flapped weakly, a heartbeat made of cloth. That night, long after the flames had burned themselves into embers, Father O'Callaghan found Commander Taylor sitting on the ruined deck. The stars were out, reflected in the oil-slick sea. The ship groaned beneath them, wounded but alive. "You think she'll make it home?" Taylor asked quietly. O'Callaghan looked toward the horizon. "She already has." And in the stillness between them, surrounded by ghosts, the Franklin began to drift, not toward death but toward immortality. Morning broke with a strange kind of mercy. The sun rose pale and cold over the endless Pacific, its reflection dancing weakly across an ocean slick with oil and ash. The USS Franklin, gutted and barely alive, drifted in that light like a phantom. Her decks warped, her island a skeleton of twisted beams, her hull burned down to bare metal. And yet she floated. No one on board could explain why she hadn't gone under. Logic said she should have. The fires had eaten through 5 decks. The explosions had opened gashes long enough to drive a jeep through, and the weight of hundreds of tons of seawater sloshed in her belly. But the Franklin's heart still beat. Her pumps were dead, her engines silent, but her steel lungs refused to fill with water. In the first hour after dawn, Commander Joe Taylor climbed to the bridge. His uniform stiff with soot, his face gray with exhaustion. He looked down at the deck and what was left of it. The entire forward section had caved in. The hangar below was a furnace of smoldering metal. Everywhere he looked were silhouettes. Men sitting, standing, or kneeling amid the ruin, staring out to sea as if unsure whether they were still alive. Taylor turned to the captain. "Sir, we can tow her." Garrus didn't answer right away. His eyes were hollow. He had spent the entire night pacing between the chart table and the shattered window, replaying the same choice in his mind: abandon ship or defy the ocean. "Tow cables?" he muttered. "The Santa Fe's still standing by," Taylor said. "We rig lines through the stern cleats. If we can keep her trimmed and stop the flooding, we might make Ulithi. Ulithi, the great anchorage 600 miles away." To the men listening, it sounded like a fantasy. But in that moment, fantasy was all they had left. By 0900, the cruiser Santa Fe had returned, her decks crowded with survivors who refused to rest. They were black with soot, bandaged, limping. But when Fitz called for volunteers to man the Franklin's tow, every hand went up. Lines were cast, cables snaked across the oil-slick sea. The two ships inched closer until their hulls almost kissed, the Franklin towering above her smaller savior like a dying giant leaning on a friend. The first cable snapped. The sound echoed like a gunshot. A second was attached, reinforced with chain. Slowly, painfully, the Santa Fe began to pull. The Franklin groaned, shifted, then steadied. For the first time in 24 hours, she was moving. Down below. The engineers still alive, men from the Black Gang who had spent the night breathing smoke in the engine rooms, worked to patch leaks and drain compartments by hand. They rigged pumps from scavenged hoses, jerry-rigged power from auxiliary batteries, anything to keep the sea at bay. Each turn of a valve was a prayer. Taylor went among them, sleeves rolled up, helping drag burned cables out of the bilge. "If we can get the generators online," he said, "we can give her lights again." When the first bulb flickered to life, one weak, trembling glow in the forward passageway, men cheered. It was nothing, a single light in a floating tomb, but it was proof that she still breathed. By midday, the Franklin's dead began to give up their silence. Teams moved through the lower decks, collecting bodies, covering them in canvas, carrying them topside for burial. The air smelled of burned oil and salt, of iron and death. Some of the bodies were so fused to the steel that men used chisels to free them. Others were carried in sections of tarp, nameless. At the edge of the flight deck, Father O'Callahan led the funeral detail. His voice was hoarse, his hands blistered, but his words carried over the sea like wind through rigging. "They fought the fire," he said simply, "and the fire could not take them." One by one, the shrouded forms slid into the Pacific. The water closed over them without a sound. The waves carried their reflections until the light consumed them. When the last one was gone, the men went back to work. There was no time to mourn. The Franklin still needed saving. As the hours passed, the Pacific began to turn. The wind shifted, the waves rose, the sea darkened with a low, heavy swell. The Santa Fe strained against her cables, the Franklin's weight dragging her backward. The strain gauges screamed. At 1400, another cable snapped, whipping across the deck and killing 2 men instantly. Garrus gave the order to hold fast. "We lose her here," he said, "and she'll be gone before nightfall." The destroyer USS Miller moved in to help, circling close to lash new tow lines across the Franklin's bow. Sailors worked waist-deep in the sea, securing the lines as waves crashed over them. Every inch of progress was paid for in blood and exhaustion. By evening, the storm thickened. The horizon vanished in a wall of rain. The Franklin's burned decks flooded again, seawater sloshing through the craters. Men tied themselves to railings to keep from being swept away. In the darkness, the glow of the fires below still pulsed, red, dull, stubborn, like the heartbeat of a wounded leviathan. Taylor stayed on the bridge, guiding the repair parties through radio lines that barely worked. He could no longer feel his hands. They were raw from handling cables and metal. He looked at O'Callahan, who stood by the doorway, still in his torn cassock, rain plastering it to his skin. "You should be below," Taylor said. The priest smiled faintly. Someone has to keep watch. They stood together, listening to the wind. When dawn came, the storm was gone. The sky was clear, impossibly blue. And ahead, far ahead, was a faint smudge on the horizon, the shape of Ulithi Atoll. The Franklin had survived the impossible. She had burned for 36 hours, been bombed, gutted, nearly capsized, and now she was being towed home at 4 knots. Her decks were gone, her guns silent, her crew decimated, but she was still the Franklin CV-13, alive against every law of nature and war. When the first radio signal reached Pearl Harbor, the message was short and unbelievable. USS Franklin proceeding under tow. Still afloat, the reply came hours later, from an admiral who couldn't believe what he was reading. God Almighty. That evening, as the atoll's reefs appeared in full view, the Santa Fe released her tow and the Franklin drifted under her own weight. Tugboats swarmed around her, guiding the wounded giant into the anchorage. Other ships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, lined the harbor, their crews standing silently on deck. They had heard the rumors, the stories of the carrier that refused to die. Now they watched her glide in, her paint burned away, her hull scarred and black, her flag still flying. As she passed, men on every ship saluted. No whistles, no cheers, just silence. Taylor stood on the bridge beside Garris. The captain's eyes were red, his uniform stiff with salt. "How many?" he asked quietly. Taylor looked at his list. 724 confirmed dead. More missing. Garris nodded slowly. And yet, he looked at the horizon. She came home. Father O'Callahan said nothing. He just closed his eyes and whispered a prayer for the ones who hadn't. That night, as the Franklin settled into anchorage, divers went over the side to inspect her hull. They expected to find the bottom split open, the plating warped beyond recognition, but what they found left them speechless. Despite the bomb hits, despite the inferno, the Franklin's keel was intact. Her armor belt, though scorched, held firm. Even the seams that should have split under the heat had somehow stayed fused. It was as if the ship herself had clenched every bolt, every rivet, and refused to let go. When the divers surfaced, they stared up at her black silhouette and simply shook their heads. One of them, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, said softly, "She shouldn't be here. But she is. The Franklin would never fight again. She was too badly damaged, her wounds too deep. But she had done something no other ship in naval history ever had. She had taken the worst beating imaginable and lived to tell the tale. The survivors never forgot." Years later, they would gather under the name the 724 Club, one for every man who died saving her. At reunions, they would raise glasses and tell the same truth over and over. The ship didn't survive because of steel. She survived because we refused to let her sink. And in the quiet between their laughter and their tears, someone would always add, "She was more than a ship. She was us." The Franklin entered Ulithi like a ghost. Every ship in the anchorage fell silent as the battered carrier drifted through the lagoon, escorted by destroyers that looked small beside her broken hull. Smoke still curled from the vents. Her deck sagged, cratered and black. Her elevators gone, her flight deck warped into ripples of steel. The men who watched her arrival could not believe she was real. Not a legend, not a rumor, but the wreck that refused to die. When the tugs eased her into position beside a repair ship, the stillness broke. Crews lined the rails of every vessel in the lagoon, standing at attention. They didn't cheer. They didn't wave. They just watched, hats in hand, the way men look upon something sacred. Because in the Pacific of 1945, there was no monument, no cathedral, no symbol of survival like the USS Franklin. The first inspection teams climbed aboard at dusk. They found a world frozen in the aftermath of apocalypse. Every corridor was black with soot, every wall blistered. The flight deck was a minefield of twisted plane parts, melted guns, and fragments of human bone. Below, the hangar looked like the inside of a furnace. The deck plates warped, bulkheads split, aircraft engines fused to the floor. Even now the air smelled of fuel and death. Chief Inspector William Daniels, a veteran of damage assessments at Pearl Harbor, stopped at the edge of the hangar and took off his cap. "I've seen ships gutted," he said softly. "But this is something else. This ship shouldn't be afloat." And yet she was. For the surviving crew, Ulithi was both salvation and sorrow. They were alive and barely, but their ship felt like a tomb. Everywhere they went, they saw ghosts. Half-melted helmets, rifles bent into arcs, patches of deck scorched with the outlines of men who'd been there a second too long. Commander Joe Taylor walked through what had once been the ready room. The bulkheads were gone, the floor buckled. On one surviving panel, someone had chalked a message in soot. "We kept her floating." Taylor ran his hand over the words. The chalk smeared under his fingers, leaving a gray trail on his skin. Father O'Callaghan found him there, the light from the open deck behind him turning the smoke into a halo. "She looks worse in daylight," the priest said quietly. Taylor nodded. "She shouldn't have made it this far." "She made it because she had to," O'Callaghan said. "The same reason we did." The repair crews worked around the clock. Welding torches cut through twisted metal. Cranes lifted burned-out turrets. Divers sealed cracks below the waterline, but even they knew it was futile. The Franklin's damage ran too deep. Her engines were ruined, her superstructure a skeleton, her interior a grave. Still, Garrus wouldn't let go. He stood on the bridge every morning, overseeing the work, his uniform crisp even among ruin. To him, the Franklin was more than a ship. She was his command, his responsibility, his proof that even in the face of annihilation, command meant never surrendering. When a young officer suggested decommissioning her on the spot, Garrus turned on him with fire in his eyes. "She's not dead until the Navy says she is," he snapped. But beneath his anger was something else. Guilt. He knew what the cost had been. In the days that followed, news of the Franklin's survival spread across the Pacific and back home to the States. Newspapers called her the ship that wouldn't die. Families of the crew read the headlines with disbelief, thinking of sons and brothers listed as missing. For every name confirmed alive, another appeared marked by silence. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz himself ordered a commendation for extraordinary heroism and devotion under fire beyond all measure. When the message reached Ulithi, O'Callaghan was summoned to the quarterdeck. The captain stood waiting, holding a telegram. "Father," Garrus said, "this one's for you." The priest read it, eyes narrowing. He didn't say anything. Later he would learn that he'd been nominated for the Medal of Honor, the first Navy chaplain ever to receive it. But in that moment, he just looked back at the Franklin's twisted tower and whispered, "They're the ones who earned it." 2 weeks later, the order came. The Franklin was to be taken across the Pacific for repair at Pearl Harbor, then home to the States. It sounded impossible. The ship's engines were inoperative. Her steering was jammed, but the engineers rigged a temporary system, makeshift rudders, patched hydraulic lines, and portable pumps to keep her trimmed. On April 3, 1945, the Franklin began her journey home. The Santa Fe, her rescuer, took position off her bow once more, towing the carrier across thousands of miles of open ocean. The sea was calm, the sky cloudless, as though nature itself had bowed in respect. For 30 days they moved at a crawl, 4 knots against the Pacific's vastness. Each day sailors on watch would see the same sight, the burned silhouette of the Franklin trailing smoke like incense, her flag still flying. They passed Iwo Jima, still fresh with the scars of battle. They passed Okinawa, where new storms of steel raged, and through it all, the Franklin kept her course, carried by the same invisible strength that had saved her before. When they reached Pearl Harbor, the harbor guns fired a salute. Every ship in port turned its flags half-mast. The Franklin glided past the wrecks of those who had died on December 7th, their rusting hulls visible just beneath the waves. She passed the Arizona, her mast still protruding from the water, a ghost watching a ghost. And in that moment, the men aboard understood. They were bringing home a ship that had already crossed into legend. Reporters called it the greatest comeback in naval history. Admirals came aboard to walk her decks, shaking their heads in disbelief. The official inspection teams logged the damage, filling page after page with the impossible math of survival. 4 dead, 25 wounded, 18 direct bomb hits, 60 secondary explosions, 36 hours on fire, 2,500 tons of ordnance detonated. And yet, the hull was intact. The ship had not sunk. Nimitz himself came to see her. He stood on the bridge beside Garrus and O'Callaghan, looking out across the ruined flight deck. For a long time he said nothing. Then quietly, "Gentlemen, I've seen a lot of ships die, but this one lived because her crew refused to let her go. O'Callaghan looked at him, eyes tired but unbroken. She lived because God wasn't finished with her yet. The Franklin never saw combat again. When the war ended, she was sent to Brooklyn Navy Yard for decommissioning. The men who had saved her scattered, some back to the fleet, some home to quiet lives. But the Franklin stayed in their dreams. They called her Big Ben, and even decades later, they would wake at night hearing the explosions, smelling the smoke, feeling the deck tremble beneath their feet. For Captain Garris, the ghost never left. He was haunted by the decisions, the orders, the moments of hesitation that cost so many lives. When he retired, he refused to speak publicly about the Franklin again. But every year, on the anniversary of March 19th, he would sit in his study and light a single candle for the men who had fought, and for the ship that wouldn't die. And for Father O'Callaghan, the story ended as it began, with faith. When he accepted the Medal of Honor from President Truman, he did so quietly, without ceremony. He never spoke of the fire, or of the day the sea itself tried to claim them. All he said was, "There are no heroes on the Franklin, only survivors." Years later, when divers explored her hull at the reserve yard, they were astonished again. The steel below the waterline was scarred but not cracked. The keel was sound. The welds had held under heat that should have melted everything. They ran their hands along the plating and found something they couldn't explain. A ship that had no right to still exist, and yet did. One of them, an old Navy diver who had seen the wrecks at Midway and Okinawa, surfaced with tears in his eyes. "She's still talking," he said softly. "You can feel it in the metal. She remembers, and maybe she did." The USS Franklin was struck from the Naval Register in 1964. Her remains were sold for scrap, but to the men who had fought for her and to those who came after, she was never gone. In every carrier that came after, the Essex, the Midway, the Enterprise, the Nimitz, there was a little of the Franklin's soul welded into their steel. The lesson she left was simple and eternal. Ships are built of metal, but they live and die by the courage of men. And in that long gray line of American carriers, there was one that proved the impossible, that even when fire and sea conspired to erase her from history, she refused. She stayed afloat. She came home, and she never surrendered. The years after the Franklin's ordeal moved like a tide that refused to recede. The war ended, the world rebuilt, and the oceans that had once been crimson with flame turned blue again. But in every corner of the Pacific, in every naval port from Norfolk to Yokosuka, men still whispered her name. USS Franklin, CV-13, the ship that wouldn't die. Her story became legend, then myth, then memory. But for those who had lived through her inferno, it was never history. It was a scar that pulsed in time with their own hearts. When she reached the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1946, she looked less like a warship and more like the fossil of a beast that had crawled through fire. The workers who first set foot aboard were silent. Her decks, once alive with aircraft engines and shouted orders, were still blackened. Melted aluminum pooled in corners like rivers frozen mid-flow. The steel bulkheads were rippled and twisted. The remnants of flight control rooms hung open to the sky. But beneath that ruin there was still strength. The inspectors walked her length and whispered, "She shouldn't be standing." For months, welders and machinists dismantled her piece by piece, stripping away the layers of war like the bark of an old tree. They found artifacts embedded in her steel. A melted dog tag fused into a hatch, a pair of spectacles half buried in slag, a rosary dangling from a beam untouched by fire. Each item was logged, cleaned, and stored, tiny fragments of a ship that had transcended mortality. When a naval historian opened her logbook, its pages charred around the edges, he found the last legible line written in pencil, "Still afloat. Still fighting." That phrase would outlive the ship herself. In the years that followed, the Franklin became something more than a burned hull. She became a test of memory. The Navy used her as a case study in endurance, in how much punishment a vessel could take and still remain buoyant. Engineers from across the fleet examined her skeleton, trying to understand why her rivets hadn't failed, why her plates hadn't torn apart. Some said it was luck. Others said it was the precision of American engineering. But the men who had been there knew the truth. It wasn't metal that saved her. It was will. At memorials across the country, survivors gathered each March 19th to remember. They came in dress blues and worn jackets, their metals dull with age but their eyes bright with memory. They called themselves the 724, after the number of men who had died that morning. And when they stood together, they didn't talk about tactics or orders or blame. They talked about the sound, the thunder that came from inside the ship, the roar of fuel tanks rupturing, the heartbeat of the ocean itself hammering on the hull. Joe Taylor, older now, his hair white, once said during a reunion, "When the fire hit us, I thought the ship was gone, but she never gave up. She fought us to stay alive, and we fought back. It was like she was part of us, or we were part of her." Father Joseph O'Callahan never glorified what happened. To him, the Franklin was a miracle paid for in human cost. In his later years, when asked about the Medal of Honor, he would simply say, "It belongs to the men who carried bombs through fire. It belongs to the ones who never came home." He died in 1964, the same year the Franklin was officially stricken from the Naval Register, as if the ship had waited for her priest before finally letting go. When the order came to scrap her, the Navy sent a tug to the reserve fleet at Bayonne, New Jersey, where she had sat rusting in silence for nearly 2 decades. The crew who oversaw the dismantling said the process felt wrong, almost sacrilegious. "She didn't want to go," one of them said. The first torch cut through her hull with a groan that echoed across the shipyard, as if something deep inside was sighing. Piece by piece, the Franklin disappeared. But not all of her. Sections of her flight deck were salvaged, small squares of steel given to museums, veterans' halls, and memorials. The largest surviving fragment became part of the National Museum of the U.S. Navy, its surface still blackened, the grain of burned metal rippling like the imprint of fire. When visitors run their fingers across it, they can feel the ridges where the heat warped the steel, the touch of history itself. One sailor, decades later, brought his grandson to see it. "This," he said, placing the boy's hand on the cold surface, "this is what courage feels like." The Franklin's legacy extended far beyond her wreckage. Her ordeal transformed naval engineering. The Navy redesigned flight decks, improved fire suppression systems, and reworked ordnance handling protocols because of her. Every carrier that sailed afterward, from the Midway to the Enterprise, the Nimitz, and beyond, carried lessons written in Franklin's flame. In a sense, she became the mother of the modern fleet, her suffering ensuring that no ship would ever burn like that again. But the human legacy was deeper still. The Franklin reminded the world that war is not just about battles won or lost. It is about survival against everything that says you shouldn't. When the Navy produced a film about her in 1947, titled "The Ship That Wouldn't Die," it was meant as propaganda. But for the men who watched it, sitting in dark theaters with eyes wet and hands clenched, it wasn't propaganda at all. It was memory. In the film's closing scene, a narrator said, "A ship is only as strong as the men who fight for her, and sometimes the men are only as strong as the ship that carries them." The words echoed long after the reel ended. By the 1970s, the survivors were few. Their hair silver, their gait slow, but every year they gathered at the same place. A small chapel overlooking the Hudson River, where the light at dawn looked like the reflection off a calm sea. Inside hung a brass plaque bearing the Franklin's crest, the phoenix rising from flames. Beneath it were the words, "They saved her and she saved them." During the 30th reunion, one of the last engineers from the Franklin's Black Gang, a man named Frank Kitchen, stood up to speak. His voice trembled but never broke. "We didn't think about medals," he said. "We didn't think about history. We just didn't want her to sink." Every man had his hand on that ship's heart, and she kept beating. The room fell silent. Then one by one they raised their glasses, not to victory, but to endurance. In 1995, 50 years after the fire, the survivors made one final voyage together, to the site where the Franklin had nearly died, 50 miles off the coast of Japan. They chartered a small ship, bringing with them wreaths, flags, and a fragment of her deck preserved under glass. The sea that day was calm, unnervingly so, as if remembering. Father O'Callahan's successor, a Navy chaplain, read the same prayer the priest had spoken amid the flames. The veterans stood in a line along the rail, faces to the wind, their medals glinting faintly in the morning light. When the last wreath touched the water, a hush fell. Then one voice, cracked with age but steady, began to hum, the Navy hymn. Others joined quietly at first, then louder, until the sound rose above the waves. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm hath bound the restless wave. When the final note faded, the sea remained silent. A gull cried somewhere overhead. The old men looked out across the endless blue, and for a moment they saw her again, the Franklin, burning but unbroken, moving through smoke and flame toward the light. That was how they chose to remember her. Not as the wreck she became, not as a casualty of war, but as the embodiment of something indestructible. And long after the last survivor passed away, her spirit endured in every sailor who stepped onto a carrier deck and looked down at the sea below. In every clang of steel, in every rumble of the engines, in every flight deck cleared for launch, a whisper lived on, still afloat, still fighting, because ships, like men, die twice, once when they sink and once when they are forgotten. The Franklin never sank, and she has never been forgotten.